Hi everyone, my name is Bahar, and today we're going to be learning about plot structures featuring The Outsiders. So, what is the plot of a story? A plot is a sequence of events that make up a story, which may also be called a narrative. The definition of a narrative is a spoken or written account of connected events and essentially means the same thing as a story. A plot can apply to any story, not just books. You can see a plot in movies, poetry, short stories, TV shows, anything that conveys a series of events. Stories can be told orally or through speaking. They can be sung, they can be filmed, and they can be told to an audience in many ways. And they all often have plots. Now, what is a subplot? Books usually have multiple conflicts that drive the plot, or cause the events throughout the book. There is usually one main conflict that drives the main plot of the story, but there can also be subplots. A subplot is a secondary plot or storyline that occurs at the same time as the main plot. When you're reading a long novel, you may notice to reach the climax there are many other small plots in the story, usually consisting of the side characters. Subplots often connect to main plots and help contribute to make the main plot seem more realistic or help contribute to the themes that the author wants to convey. They also often involve supporting characters, which are all of the characters besides the main ones. By involving those characters, it also helps make those characters seem more complex and more realistic. So, in a story or plot structure, there are five basic parts. The first is the exposition. The exposition usually introduces the setting, the time period, the main characters, and even the main conflict. Then you go into the rising action, which usually has smaller conflicts, introduction to side characters, new settings, until it reaches the climax. The climax is sometimes mistaken for the most exciting part of the story, but the correct definition is the climax is the turning point of the story. It's when the story takes a turn for a new direction. After the climax, there is a falling action, which deflates the tension experienced during the climax until the resolution, which is what wraps up and concludes a story. So, these parts of this basic story structure are not all the same length. These are labels for the parts of a story and they can often overlap, or the end of one can act as the beginning of another. And we can look more at this later when we work in the lesson. So first, let's dive into the exposition. The exposition of a story is the beginning of a story where the setting, the main characters, and the main conflict are introduced. There can be multiple conflicts, but usually there is one main conflict that drives the story. Sometimes parts of the setting, like the time period or the exact location, can be inferred or figured out by looking at the character's clothing and environment. In The Outsiders, this is the beginning of the book, where we meet the main character, Ponyboy Curtis, and his family, Dairy and Soda Pop. The reader learns that Ponyboy and his friends, who are also introduced, consider themselves as the poor people, greasers, and that there are rich people called socials or socias. The main conflict is introduced as the rivalry between the greasers and the socias. The exposition also introduces some of the socias before the conflict escalates. To escalate means to become more intense or serious. This helps develop the reader's understanding of who the socias are. This would be when Johnny, Ponyboy, and Dairy go to the drive-in, which is an outdoor movie theater where people watch a large movie on a large screen while staying in their cars. There they meet Cherry Valance and her friend Marcia, who are Socs. Later, the reader is also introduced to Bob and his friends, who are also Socs. Because the author introduces Bob and his friends when they are intoxicated, which means to be drunk, and reckless, this also characterizes the Socs and helps develop the reader's opinion of them. You may notice you first received a negative opinion of the Socs. So now let's see what the rising action is. The rising action is when the characters recognize the conflict and take action. The events of the rising action act to give depth to the characters or to make them more realistic and engaging to readers, and to add more complexity or detail to the conflict. Usually, there is one distinct incident that begins the rising action. In The Outsiders, the starter incident would be when Johnny and Ponyboy kill Bob, because it causes a larger conflict between the Socs and the Greasers, as it emphasizes the fighting that has occurred between the two groups in the past. So, more significant events that are part of rising action include Johnny and Ponyboy running away and hiding at the church, Johnny deciding to turn himself into the police, the fire inside the church in which Johnny is badly hurt trying to save some children, Dallas, Ponyboy, and Johnny returning to town, and Ponyboy talking to Randall and Cherry about how fighting between the Socs and the Greasers is only harmful to all of them. So now let's see what the climax is. The definition of a climax of a story is a culmination of all the events in the rising action. That means it is an event that represents the conflict that has been building up throughout the story. It serves as the turning point which resolves or tells the reader an answer to the conflict. This answer may not always be clear, and it could even be a message that the conflict is not able to be truly resolved. In The Outsiders, the climax would be the rumble, or the fight between the Socs and the Greasers. It is a literal fight in which both sides physically fight each other to see who will win, which reflects how they have fought each other in the past. It reaffirms the theme that fighting does not resolve the issues between the Socs and the Greasers, and that it only hurts all of them. So remember, the climax of the story tends to come later in the book, but there is no exact point that it has to be at. In The Outsiders, the climax is a literal, physical fight between the Socs and the Greasers, but not all books have a fight between the opposing forces. The conflict can even be figurative. For example, a book's conflict and plot can be about a mental or internal conflict within a character. So let's see the falling action. The falling action of a story includes the events following the climax and often serves as a part in which the narrative helps deflate the plot's tension and gives the character time to unwind after the emotional scene. In The Outsiders, these events are the ones that take place after the rumble. Dally and Ponyboy run back to the hospital and witness Johnny pass away, and then Dally is killed by the police. Ponyboy stays at home and processes all the events that has happened. And number 5, the resolution. The resolution would be at the end of the book when the conflict has been resolved. To be resolved means for something to have been solved with a solution or a way to fix a conflict or a problem. For this reason, the final part of the book is also called the conclusion, or the denouement. The word denouement is French for the final outcome, and in this case, the final outcome of a story. The English language borrows this word from France. In The Outsiders, the resolution would be the very end of the book when Ponyboy talks to his teacher about a writing assignment and then is implied, indirectly told to the readers to have started writing The Outsiders. So this is a plot structure, and we can see the exposition, initiating events, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. So this is a little bit simplified, but the exposition is when Ponyboy, his family, and his friends are introduced. We see the initiating event that introduces the conflict between the Socs and the Greasers, and that's when Johnny and Ponyboy are jumped by Socs and kill Bob. The rising action consists of many different events. It starts off with Johnny and Ponyboy running away, and then continues with Johnny and Ponyboy staying at a church. Then Johnny and Ponyboy reunite with Dallas. And then we see the church fire in which Johnny is hurt. The boys return to town, and then Ponyboy talks to Randall and Cherry before the rumble. The climax, or the turning point of the story, is the rumble between the Greasers and the Socs. That's where they address the main conflict said in the initiating event. Then there is the falling action which leads into the resolution. Dallas and Ponyboy see Johnny die in the hospital, and then Dallas is killed by the police. Ponyboy finishes off by resolving things in court. And then Ponyboy talks to his teacher and begins writing The Outsiders, and that is what concludes the novel.